The sky looked like a grave. A deep, endless void stretched above her, vast and merciless, swallowing the last remnants of warmth as dusk settled over the barren land. The wind howled across jagged stone, carrying the scent of dust and decay, a whisper of all the lives that had been lost here before her. Rilke pulled her torn cloak tighter around her shoulders, but it did little to shield her from the cold bite of the air. Her body ached, exhaustion seeping into her bones. Every step felt heavier than the last, yet she forced herself forward, scanning the horizon with sharp, violet eyes. She would not die here. Not yet. She was not the first to be sent to this planet, and she knew she wouldn't be the last. Her people called it Varanus, but among the exiled, it had another name, the Grave World. It was a place of judgment, a world where the condemned were left to prove their worth or perish in silence. Some called it a test, a chance at redemption, but she knew better. It was a slow execution. The atmosphere was barely breathable, tainted with a metallic tang that left a bitter taste on her tongue. The air was thin, dry, forcing her lungs to work harder with every breath. The ground was cracked and lifeless, deep fissures cutting through the terrain like old wounds. Sparse vegetation clung desperately to the rocks, sharp, wiry plants that seemed as hostile as the world itself. Nothing truly lived here, except for the things that hunted in the dark. Her grip tightened around the crude blade she had fashioned from the remains of her ship, its metal jagged from where she had broken it free from the wreckage. It wasn't much, but it had kept her alive. For now, a distant sound broke the silence. The rhythmic clank of stone against stone. Rilke froze. She turned toward the noise, muscles tensed, senses sharp. There, by the edge of a jagged cliffside, was something impossible. A man, a human. She had heard stories of them, though she had never seen one in the flesh. Her people spoke of them as violent, reckless, primitive creatures, guided by raw instinct rather than reason. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and yet, as she watched this one, there was no sign of madness or desperation. He was building something. His back was turned to her, broad shoulders shifting beneath a dirt-streaked shirt as he lifted a massive slab of stone and set it into place with practiced efficiency. His movements were slow but deliberate, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. His skin was bronze from the sun, dark hair falling messily across his forehead as he wiped sweat from his brow. He wasn't just surviving here. He was thriving. Rilke narrowed her eyes, stepping carefully over loose gravel, adjusting her weight so her boots wouldn't scrape against the rock. She had spent too many days alone to risk an encounter with a stranger, especially one from a species she didn't trust. Then suddenly he stopped. His head turned slightly, as if sensing her before he saw her. "I was wondering when you'd get tired of hiding," he said, voice deep and rough, the kind of voice shaped by long days of silence. Rilke stiffened. The human, Gabriel, she guessed from the markings stitched into his tattered shirt, slowly straightened, rolling his shoulders before turning to face her. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze was sharp, scanning her in one sweeping glance, assessing just as she had been assessing him. Up close, he was even more formidable than she had expected. Tall, strong, but not just in the way her people had described humans, wild, unrefined. His strength was controlled, tempered by something deeper. Patience. Calculation. She said nothing. Gabriel raised an eyebrow, wiping dust from his hands onto his pants. "You speak, don't you?" Rilke hesitated, then finally murmured, "Yes." His lips quirked slightly, the ghost of amusement flickering across his face. "Good. I was starting to think I'd been talking to ghosts." She didn't rise to the bait. Her grip tightened around her blade, eyes never leaving his. "You're human." He huffed a short breath, tilting his head. "Yeah, and you're not." Another silence stretched between them, neither of them moving. Gabriel finally sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, if you're here to steal my food or my shelter, get over with. Otherwise, I've got work to do." He turned back to his half-built structure, lifting another stone as if she weren't still standing there, watching him like a predator waiting for weakness. Rilke's jaw clenched. "I don't need your help." His hands stilled on the rock. but he didn't look at her when he spoke. Yeah? Then you're either very strong or very stupid. A flicker of anger sparked in her chest. You know nothing about me. Gabriel finally turned, stepping toward her, just one step, but enough that she had to resist the instinct to retreat. I know that wound on your leg hasn't fully healed. I know you're favoring your left side to keep weight off it. And I know if you keep wandering around here alone at night, you won't make it to morning. She hated that he was right, but she hated the idea of trusting a human even more. She didn't know how she had gotten the wound. Not exactly. The crash had left her dazed, her memories scattered like the debris of her ship. She remembered fire, the acrid sting of smoke in her lungs, the weight of shattered metal pinning her down. She had pulled herself free, staggered into the wilds, but the wound on her leg had slowed her down. The creatures that lurked in this place, the ones with too many eyes and razor-like limbs, had almost finished what her people had started. But she had survived. She always survived. She took a slow breath, exhaling through her nose. You have shelter. Gabriel nodded. I do. You have food. Enough. Rilke hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to walk away, to vanish into the wild and trust no one. But she had spent days starving, cold, alone. Her people had thrown her to this planet to die. The universe had made its choice. Now, she had to make hers. Slowly, she lowered her blade. Not entirely, just enough that it was no longer pointed at him. Gabriel arched an eyebrow. That a yes? It's a temporary yes, she muttered. His smirk was brief, barely there, but she caught it. He stepped back, gesturing toward the half-built shelter. Then I'd start helping if I were you. Rilke didn't answer, but she didn't walk away either. Rilke had spent her life walking among towering spires of silver and glass, under skies filled with glowing ships that streaked between the stars. Now, she stood in the shadow of crude stone walls, surrounded by dust and silence, the scent of dry earth thick in the air. She had expected to feel out of place. She had expected to resent every moment spent here. What she hadn't expected was how alive this place felt, how Gabriel had carved something out of nothing, shaping the land like it belonged to him, like he belonged to it. She shifted her weight carefully, still favoring her injured leg, as she watched him move through the half-built structure. He worked without hesitation, muscles tensing beneath sun-worn fabric as he lifted another stone and set it into place. It was mesmerizing in a way she didn't want to admit. The efficiency, the control, the quiet confidence that radiated from him, even when he wasn't speaking. She wasn't used to humans being quiet. Gabriel barely acknowledged her presence as he worked, but that didn't mean he wasn't aware of her. She caught him glancing at her more than once, his gaze flicking over her like he was trying to decide if she was worth the effort of conversation. She wasn't sure yet if she was. You're just going to stand there? His voice broke the silence, rough but not unkind. Or do you actually plan on helping? Rilke narrowed her eyes. I didn't agree to manual labor. Gabriel gave a short huff of laughter, adjusting the stone with a practiced hand. Right. You think you're too good for it. She straightened, meeting his gaze with a sharpness that could cut stone. My people build with light and gravity fields. We don't. She gestured vaguely at the walls, drag rocks around like primitives. His lips twitched as if he found that amusing, but he didn't argue. Instead, he ran a hand over the rough surface of the wall, stepping back to admire his work. Funny thing about primitives. They survive. She didn't have a response to that. The wind picked up, kicking dust into the air, as she turned away slightly to shield her face. Gabriel, seemingly unaffected, picked up a smaller stone and tossed it toward her. She caught it reflexively, her grip tightening as she shot him a glare. He smirked. Since you're staying, you might as well make yourself useful. Rilke considered throwing it right back at him. Hard. Instead, she exhaled slowly and walked to the wall, examining where the stone might fit. Gabriel watched without comment, but she could feel the weight of his attention as she worked, as if he were silently measuring her worth, the same way she had been measuring his. She hated that it made her want to prove something. By the time the sun had begun its slow descent, the walls had grown higher, and the crude shelter felt less like a pile of stone and more like something real. Gabriel sat back against a nearby rock, pulling a flask from his belt. He took a slow sip before offering it to her. Rilke hesitated before taking it, sniffing the liquid cautiously. It had a sharp, metallic scent, like the filtered water she'd scavenged from the planet's underground reserves, but tinged with something else, something unfamiliar. "It's safe," he said, watching her. "Pulled from a deep well I found a few miles out. You'll get used to the taste." She drank, grimacing slightly at the bitter tang. But it was clean, and that was more than she had expected from this place. She handed it back without a word. Gabriel tilted his head slightly. "So, what did you do?" Rilke tensed. "What? To get sent here," he clarified, rolling the flask between his fingers. "Most people don't end up on Varanus unless they've pissed off the wrong people." She clenched her jaw, turning her gaze to the horizon. The sky had begun shifting to deep indigo, streaked with dying embers of red and orange. A world fading into night. "My people believed I was defective," she said finally. The words tasted bitter like the water. Weak, a liability to the greater whole. Gabriel didn't react, didn't offer sympathy or meaningless words of comfort. He just took another sip from the flask and leaned back. "Yeah," he murmured. "I know how that feels." That caught her off guard. Rilke studied him, but his expression remained unreadable. He wasn't telling her everything, just enough. She looked away. "And you?" Gabriel exhaled, tapping the flask against his knee. "I killed someone." The words weren't a confession. They weren't spoken with remorse or pride, just simple fact. Rilke glanced at him sharply, instinctively calculating how much of a threat he really was. But Gabriel didn't look at her. His gaze was distant, fixed on some invisible point beyond the horizon. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Then he smirked slightly, finally meeting her eyes. "Relax. It was a long time ago." She didn't relax. Gabriel chuckled, shaking his head. "You think you're the only one who got thrown away?" He gestured vaguely to the wasteland around them. "This place is a dumping ground. Doesn't matter if you're human, alien, or something in between. If you don't fit, they toss you here and let the world finish the job." Rilke knew that truth too well. She looked at the rough stone walls surrounding them, at the meager shelter Gabriel had carved out of nothing. He had survived alone. That meant something. And yet, despite his isolation, despite the clear lines he had drawn between himself and the rest of the universe, he had let her stay. That meant something too. The fire crackled between them, its glow casting flickering shadows across Gabriel's face, across the stones they had stacked together. After a long moment, Rilke spoke. "If you killed someone," she said carefully, "why did they send you here instead of executing you?" Gabriel's smirk faded, his expression hardening just slightly. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Because," he said quietly, "sometimes exile is worse." Rilke held his gaze. She understood. For the first time since she had arrived on this forsaken world, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. The first warning came in the wind. It started as a whisper, a distant murmur that stirred the dust and sent a slow, crawling unease through the air. By the time the sky began to darken, shifting from dull gray to an ominous shade of black, Rilke already knew. A storm was coming. Not just any storm, something violent. Something that could bury them alive if they weren't careful. She had spent enough time on this cursed planet to understand its moods. The way the land braced itself before disaster struck. The way the temperature dropped unnaturally fast, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Gabriel had noticed too. He stood just beyond the entrance of their crude shelter, shoulders tense, his sharp gaze fixed on the horizon. The wind tugged at his shirt, lifting strands of his dark hair as he watched the swirling mass of clouds rolling toward them. The weight of it pressed down, thick and heavy, like a predator waiting to pounce. "Looks bad," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Rilke followed his gaze, narrowing her eyes. The storm clouds pulsed with a strange, electric glow. Not lightning, something worse. "How bad?" she asked. Gabriel's jaw flexed slightly. Bad enough that if we don't reinforce this place, we'll be digging ourselves out of a rock slide by morning. She looked at the rough stone walls surrounding them. They were sturdy for now, but they hadn't yet faced something like this. And Vranis did not forgive weakness. Without another word, Gabriel moved, already grabbing what supplies they had. Rilke didn't hesitate. She fell in a step beside him, ignoring the dull ache in her injured leg as they worked. There was no time for conversation. They braced the walls with additional stone, secured their fire pit so it wouldn't be snuffed out by the wind, checked their small stash of food and water. Every movement was deliberate, every decision made with the quiet, practiced efficiency of people who had long since accepted that hesitation meant death. The sky split open. A monstrous roar of wind and rain slammed into them, and Rilke instinctively ducked back inside as the storm came alive. Rain pounded against the shelter, seeping through cracks in the stone. The wind howled through the canyons, the air filled with the sharp scent of wet earth and something metallic, something almost unnatural. Gabriel stepped in after her, shaking water from his hair. His shirt clung to him, damp from the rising humidity, but he barely seemed to notice. Then he turned to her, eyes dark and serious. "Stay inside, no matter what." Rilke bristled at the order in his tone. "I can handle myself." Gabriel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his wet hair. "I don't doubt that. But if something gives way, we won't have time for heroics." His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it, something just shy of concern. She didn't know why that unsettled her. They settled into an uneasy silence, the fire between them flickering weakly, barely holding against the drafts seeping through the walls. Gabriel pulled a knife from his belt and began sharpening it, the slow, rhythmic scrape of metal against stone almost too steady in contrast to the chaos outside. Rilke sat across from him, wrapping her arms around herself. She hated storms, not because of the cold or the wind or even the danger. She hated the memories they brought with them. She had heard storms like this before, not on this world but in another life. The night she was cast out. The council had stood above her, their cold, silver eyes reflecting the glow of the city's towering spires. She had stood before them, bruised, battered, defiant, as they passed judgment. Unfit, unworthy, expendable. She had pleaded, not for mercy, but for the right to exist. They had turned their backs on her. Her own blood had turned their backs on her. And now she was here, trapped in the dark with a man who should have been her enemy. Gabriel didn't look up from his knife, but she could tell he knew she was lost in something she didn't want to say out loud. He didn't press, didn't ask. That, more than anything, made her want to speak. "They call me defective," she murmured. Gabriel didn't react at first. His knife scraped against the stone in slow, deliberate strokes. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "And you still fought." Rilke's fingers curled against her arms. It didn't matter. Gabriel's gaze lifted to hers. "Maybe not to them, but it mattered enough for you to survive." She frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "Survival isn't victory." Gabriel held her gaze. "No, but it's the only thing that gives you a chance at one." The shelter shuddered as a particularly strong gust of wind slammed into it. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and Rilke tensed, instinctively reaching for the blade at her waist. Gabriel noticed. He didn't comment on it, didn't mock her, didn't press. Instead, he reached into the supplies and pulled out a coarse blanket. Without a word, he tossed it toward her. She caught it, blinking. Gabriel shrugged, leaning back against the wall. "Get some rest." Rilke hesitated. She wasn't used to kindness without conditions. But tonight, she was too tired to question it. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, listening to the storm, to the steady sound of Gabriel sharpening his knife, to the silence between them that no longer felt quite so empty. And for the first time since she had been cast into the void, she didn't feel entirely alone. The storm had passed, but it had left its mark. Rilke stepped outside the shelter, boots crunching against the damp, uneven ground. The air was thick with the scent of wet stone and scorched earth, a sharp contrast to the bone-dry stillness that usually hung over Vranis. Puddles of murky water pooled in the cracks of the landscape, reflecting the dull glow of the fading sun. The world felt eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made her skin prickle. She adjusted the grip on her knife and scanned the area. The wind had scattered debris across the landscape. Small stones, splintered wood, even the twisted remains of something metallic that had been lodged into the cliffside. A remnant of an old wreck, maybe, or something else. She didn't like unknowns. Behind her, Gabriel was already moving. He barely spared the damage a glance before crouching near their supply cache, inspecting what had survived the night. Looks like most of it held, he muttered, pushing aside a damp cloth to check the firewood. Shelter's still standing. Could have been worse. Rilke flicked her gaze to him. He was tired. That much was clear, the faint tension in his shoulders, the way he rolled his neck as if trying to ease the stiffness there. He hadn't slept much. Neither had she. She didn't respond, instead turning her focus to the sky. The clouds were clearing, but the deep indigo hue of night was already creeping in. "How long do these storms last?" she asked. Gabriel glanced up. "Depends." She sighed. "You always give such detailed answers." That earned her the ghost of a smirk. He pulled a small metal container from the supplies and tossed it her way. Rilke caught it smoothly, though her fingers hesitated slightly at the unexpected weight. Water. Not much, but enough. Gabriel took a swig from his own flask before wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Storms hit fast and hard, but they don't last long. We're lucky this one didn't bring anything else with it. She knew what he meant. The things that lurked on this planet were drawn to movement, to sound, to weakness. If the storm had uncovered something buried, if it had disturbed the wrong nest. Rilke rolled her shoulders, forcing the thought away. "We should check the perimeter." Gabriel nodded, grabbing his knife. They moved carefully, scanning the terrain for anything out of place. Rilke took the higher ground, balancing along the uneven cliffside while Gabriel moved lower, his eyes sweeping over the terrain with practiced precision. Despite herself, Rilke found herself watching him, not out of distrust, but out of something else. Observation. Humans were supposed to be unpredictable, reckless. But Gabriel wasn't. His movements were deliberate, precise. He knew how to step without shifting too much weight, how to listen, how to keep his weapon at the ready without making it obvious he was prepared to use it. He was cautious, controlled, not what she had expected. She forced her gaze away. By the time they returned to the shelter, the last light of day was fading and the temperature was already beginning to drop. The fire inside the shelter had burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the dim light. Gabriel added more wood without a word, coaxing the flames back to life. Rilke lowered herself onto one of the makeshift seats, a large, flat stone that had been smoothed down by time and patience. She stretched out her leg carefully, flexing her foot to test the soreness still lingering in her muscles. Gabriel settled across from her, the flickering light casting sharp shadows across his face. He didn't say anything at first, just stared into the fire. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was something else. Rilke exhaled, tilting her head slightly. "How long have you been here?" Gabriel didn't look at her. "Long enough." Not an answer. Not really. She studied him, watching the way his fingers absently tapped against his knee. He did that when he was thinking, measuring his words. Rilke leaned forward, resting her arms against her legs. And before this? Gabriel finally glanced up, his dark eyes unreadable. She thought, for a moment, that he wouldn't answer. Then, quietly, before this, it was a soldier. It was the first piece of personal information he had willingly given her. Rilke absorbed that, watching the way his expression shifted, subtle but noticeable. A flicker of something that passed too quickly for her to catch. She didn't press. Instead, she nodded toward his knife. "And now?" Gabriel smirked faintly, rolling the blade between his fingers. "Now, I build walls and sharpen things." Rilke huffed a quiet breath, shaking her head. "You're insufferable." Gabriel grinned. "You're still here." She didn't have a response to that. For a while, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled between them, its warmth seeping into the stone, into the silence. Then, without thinking, Rilke reached forward. It was instinct, A fleeting moment of curiosity, of something else. Her fingers brushed the edge of his knife, just where the blade met the hilt. Gabriel stilled. His gaze flicked to where her hand hovered near his. He didn't pull away, didn't move. Neither did she. The moment stretched, unspoken and fragile. Then, slowly, deliberately, Gabriel shifted his grip, turning the knife so the hilt faced her. An offering. Rilke hesitated, then took it. The weight was familiar, different from the weapons of her people, but balanced, solid. She turned it in her hands, testing the way it fell against her palm. Gabriel watched her, his expression unreadable. Finally, she handed it back. Their fingers brushed as he took it. It was a small thing, barely a touch, but Rilke felt it. Gabriel must have too, because for a brief second, his breath hitched. Then, as if nothing had happened, he leaned back, rolling his shoulders. You should sleep. Rilke arched a brow. Giving orders now? Gabriel smirked, shifting to get comfortable. Just a suggestion. She didn't argue. But as she settled against the stone wall, pulling the blanket around her, she was aware of him in a way she hadn't been before. Of the warmth of the fire, of the echo of his touch lingering on her skin. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long, long time, she didn't feel alone. The moment Gabriel stepped back into the shelter, Rilke knew something was wrong. His movements were too controlled, too deliberate, like a man trying to mask pain. The firelight flickered against his face, casting sharp shadows over his tired features, and as he shifted, she saw it. The dark stains seeping through his sleeve, spreading in uneven lines down his forearm. Blood. She was on her feet before she even realized it. What happened? Gabriel exhaled through his nose, dropping his knife onto the stone ledge near the fire. His fingers flexed briefly before clamping down on his injured arm, the motion small but telling. Ran into something unfriendly, he muttered. I'll live. Rilke narrowed her eyes, stepping closer. His shirt was torn just above the elbow, the fabric soaked through. The wound beneath wasn't fresh. It had been bleeding for some time. You should have come back sooner, she said, already reaching for their supplies. Gabriel let out a quiet, humorless chuckle, shifting to sit against the shelter wall. I had things to do. She shot him a sharp glare. Dying isn't one of them. His smirk was faint but there, even as he let her push his sleeve up. The gash was deep, the skin around it already swelling, bruising at the edges. Not a bite. A blade, maybe, or claws. Rilke frowned. This wasn't an accident. Gabriel didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned his head back against the stone, closing his eyes for a beat. Didn't say it was. That wasn't an answer, and she knew it. But she also knew she wouldn't get more unless he wanted to give it. She pressed a damp cloth against the wound, and he tensed under her hands, his jaw clenching. Hold still, she ordered. Not used to being patched up by an alien, he admitted, his voice edged with something unreadable. She ignored the comment, focused on the slow, steady movements of cleaning the wound. Not used to patching up a human, she countered, pulling out the small container of antiseptic she had salvaged from an old wreck. The silvery paste gleamed under the dim firelight as she spread it across his skin. Gabriel barely flinched, but she could feel the way he forced himself to stay still. It looks worse than it is, he muttered. Rilke wasn't convinced. The wound was deep enough that, if left untreated, it would slow him down. On this planet, being slow was the same as being dead. You need to rest, she said, voice quieter now. Gabriel cracked an eye open. You sound like you care. She scowled. I just don't want to drag your corpse into the desert tomorrow. That got a low chuckle out of him, but he didn't argue. She finished securing the bandage, tying it off tightly, before sitting back on her heels to study him. His face was unreadable, his dark eyes locked onto the fire. For once, he wasn't teasing, wasn't trying to deflect with humor. She hesitated, then asked, What is this? Gabriel exhaled, stretching his fingers as if testing the movement in his arm. A mistake, he said finally. She frowned. A mistake doesn't leave a wound like that. He tilted his head slightly, considering her. Then, with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes, he said, You ask a lot of questions. Rilke crossed her arms. You give a lot of half answers. Gabriel huffed a laugh, shaking his head. Fair enough. Silence settled between them, broken only by the steady crackle of the fire. The storm had left the air colder than usual, and Rilke adjusted the blanket around her shoulders without thinking. She could feel Gabriel watching her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, just aware. "You're good at this," he said after a long moment. She raised a brow. "At what?" "Surviving." Rilke didn't answer immediately. Her entire life had been about proving she could survive, that she was strong enough, fast enough, ruthless enough. And still, it had never been enough for her people. But here, in this ruined place, she wasn't proving anything. She was just living. "You too," she said finally. Gabriel smirked. "Yeah, I try." Another pause. Then, softer, more real, "You saved my ass today." Rilke met his gaze, something flickering between them. A shift, subtle but undeniable. She had been alone for so long. So had he. And for the first time, maybe neither of them had to be. The wind carried the scent of damp stone and scorched earth, remnants of the last storm still clinging to the air. Varanus had quieted for now, but Rilke had learned that peace on this planet was always temporary. She sat near the fire, absently sharpening her blade. The steady scrape of metal against rock was familiar, grounding. Across from her, Gabriel was doing the same, though with less focus. His arm was healing, but he still favored it, adjusting his grip every so often. The firelight flickered, casting shifting shadows along the rough stone walls. The shelter had started to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like something real, something they had built together. Rilke wasn't sure when that realization had settled in, but it lingered now, a quiet weight in the back of her mind. "You always this quiet?" Gabriel's voice broke through the crackling fire, casual but edged with curiosity. She glanced at him. "You always this talkative?" He smirked, tilting his knife in his palm. "Depends on the company." Rilke huffed a quiet breath, returning her attention to her blade. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt easier than it had before, less like two strangers sharing space, and more like something else. Gabriel shifted, rolling his injured shoulder with a wince. She noticed the movement, but he didn't acknowledge it. He was stubborn that way. "You shouldn't be using that arm yet," she said. Gabriel shrugged. "I've had worse." She set her knife down, leveling him with a look. "And yet, you're still an idiot." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You wound me. Not as badly as whatever did that to you," she muttered. Gabriel didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for a flask at his side, taking a slow sip before passing it to her. She hesitated for half a second before taking it, the weight of the gesture settling between them. She took a careful drink, the water cool against her throat, then handed it back. Gabriel leaned back against the stone, eyes flicking toward the dark sky visible through the cracks in the shelter. "You ever think about what comes next?" Rilke frowned. "Next?" He gestured vaguely to their surroundings. "We're not just surviving anymore. We're making this place livable." Feels like that should mean something. She hadn't thought about it in those terms. For so long, she had been focused on endurance, getting through the next night, the next fight, the next storm. The idea of building something, of looking beyond survival, had never seemed like an option. But now, she looked around at the walls they had reinforced, at the supplies they had gathered, at Gabriel, and she realized he was right. This wasn't just survival anymore. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never had the luxury of thinking about what comes next." Gabriel studied her for a moment, something unreadable in his gaze. Then, quietly, he said, "Maybe it's time you did." She didn't know how to respond to that. Instead, she reached for the flask again, taking another drink. This time, when she handed it back, their fingers brushed. It was fleeting, barely a touch, but it sent a strange warmth through her, something unfamiliar and not entirely unwelcome. Gabriel must have felt it too, because his grip lingered just a second longer than necessary before he took the flask from her hand. Neither of them said anything, but something had shifted, something neither of them could ignore. The silence felt wrong. Rilke had learned to read Varanus like a living thing, to listen to the wind, the way it carried whispers of unseen dangers. Now, there was nothing. No distant howls, no shifting of loose rock, just the stillness of something waiting. She slowed her steps, instinct tightening in her chest. One hand drifted to the knife at her hip, fingers curling around the worn grip. Gabriel, walking a few steps ahead, sensed it too. He stopped without a word, his posture shifting, weight centered. His good hand was already at his blade. They weren't alone. The realization came a second too late. A blur of motion erupted from the shadows, fast, low to the ground, too close. Gabriel barely had time to turn before something slammed into him, claws scraping against his jacket. He staggered but didn't fall, twisting at the last second and driving his knife up, but the creature was already retreating. Not a direct attack. A test. Rilke spun at the sound of shifting gravel behind her. Another shape moved in the darkness, coiled tight, waiting for her to make the first mistake. Her grip tightened. Stalkers. Gabriel exhaled sharply. Of course it's stalkers. They weren't the biggest predators on Varanus, but they were some of the worst. They were patient, smart. They hunted in packs, wearing their prey down, striking only when the advantage was theirs. Tonight, they had miscalculated. Rilke moved first. She lunged at the nearest one, closing the distance before it had time to react. Her blade sliced through the air, catching its shoulder as it leapt back, a screech tearing from its throat. The rest of the pack took that as their cue. Another charged Gabriel, but he was ready this time. He dodged, stepping sideways and slamming his forearm into the creature's ribs before driving his knife into its neck. The impact sent them both crashing into the dirt. Rilke barely had time to register it before her own opponent struck. She twisted, ducking beneath a wild swipe, but it was too fast, too close. Claws raked across her shoulder, tearing fabric, slicing skin. Pain flared, but she didn't stop. She used the momentum to drop low, driving her blade upward into the soft underside of its jaw. The stalker convulsed, legs kicking, then collapsed. She didn't get the chance to breathe. Another shape, larger, faster, came at her from the side. She turned, but too late. The impact sent her hard into the ground, knocking the breath from her lungs. A weight pinned her down, claws digging into her arms, a sharp snarl, too close to her ear. It had her. She fought, struggling against its grip, trying to get an angle. Asterisk, asterisk, anything. Asterisk, asterisk, but it was too strong. Then suddenly it wasn't. A sharp, brutal movement. The pressure lifted, and the creature let out a choked, gurgling sound before its weight slumped sideways. Gabriel. He was on it, dragging it off her, his blade buried deep in its side. Rilke rolled away as he yanked the knife free. The stalker gave one last, weak spasm before going still. Silence. Their breathing was loud in the stillness, both of them tense, waiting, listening. But nothing moved. It was over. Rilke pushed herself upright, ignoring the sting in her shoulder. Gabriel was already up, scanning the darkness, knife still in his grip. His jacket was torn, dirt and blood streaking his arms, but he was steady. He turned to her, eyes sharp, scanning her like he was looking for something worse than what she'd already taken. "You good?" Rilke exhaled, rolling her shoulder to test it. It ached, but she'd had worse. "I'm fine." Gabriel didn't look convinced. He stepped closer, and before she could protest, his fingers brushed against her shoulder, near the torn fabric. His touch was careful, just skimming the skin, but it still made her breath hitch. "Doesn't look fine," he muttered. Rilke swallowed, not from the pain, from the way his hand lingered, from the way his gaze met hers, something unreadable behind it. She wasn't sure which of them moved first. The space between them was already too small, and then it was gone. Gabriel's fingers slid from her shoulder to her jaw, his grip gentle but undeniable. He was close now, closer than they'd ever been. His breath was warm against her skin, his heartbeat still unsteady from the fight. She could have pulled away, but she didn't. She didn't want to. Gabriel hesitated, just for a second, searching her eyes for permission, or maybe for doubt. There wasn't any. So when he kissed her, she kissed him back. It wasn't soft. It wasn't tentative. It was desperate, like battle had stripped them down to something raw, something neither of them had the energy to fight anymore. His hand tightened at the nape of her neck, her fingers fisting in his jacket, pulling him closer, drinking in the heat, the contact, the relief of being alive. When they finally broke apart, the air between them felt charged, something unspoken still lingering. Gabriel let out a slow breath, his forehead resting lightly against hers. "Well," he murmured, a smirk tugging at his lips. "That's one way to celebrate not dying." Rilke huffed a soft laugh, though her fingers didn't loosen from his jacket. She didn't need to say anything. Neither did he, because tonight they hadn't just fought together. They'd chosen each other. And for the first time, survival wasn't the only thing that mattered. The night stretched endless above them, a sky full of unfamiliar stars. Some burned cold and distant. Others flickered softly, as if breathing in the darkness. Rilke had spent her life beneath different skies, surrounded by towering spires and artificial light, never once looking up and wondering if she'd ever find a place where she belonged. Now, she sat on the edge of a stone ledge, her legs stretched out before her, the warmth of the fire at her back. Beside her, Gabriel was silent, turning a small piece of rock over in his hands, his fingers tracing the rough edges absent-mindedly. The battle from earlier still clung to them, in the aches of their bodies, in the shallow scrapes and bruises, in the memory of almost losing something they hadn't been ready to name yet. Rilke flexed her shoulder, testing the lingering sting of the wound she'd earned. "I'll heal," she muttered, more to herself than him. Gabriel glanced at her, his gaze lingering a second too long. "You always do." The words settled between them, quiet but heavy with meaning. For the first time since being thrown onto this planet, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. Because of him. She exhaled slowly, tilting her head to look up at the stars. "When I was a child, I used to believe every star had a home beneath it," she admitted. "That if you searched long enough, you'd find where you belonged." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment. Then, "And do you still believe that?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I stopped looking." He hummed low in his throat, thoughtful. "Maybe you were just looking in the wrong places." She turned to him, ready to challenge that, but something in the way he was watching her made the words catch in her throat. There was no hesitation in his gaze, no uncertainty. Rilke swallowed. "You built this place alone," she said, glancing toward the shelter they had spent weeks reinforcing, carving it from the cliffs, shaping it into something more than just stone. Gabriel's lips curled at the edge. "That's not true." She frowned. "It was already here when I found you." He turned the small stone in his fingers once more before tossing it aside. Then he looked at her fully, his voice softer when he spoke next. "I didn't build it for just me," he admitted. "I built it for us." Rilke's breath hitched. She searched his expression, waiting for the familiar flicker of sarcasm, for some teasing remark to follow. But there was none, just quiet honesty. She had spent so long believing she had been abandoned to die alone, that her place in the universe had been decided for her. But here was Gabriel, sitting beside her, saying he had built a home, their home, before he had even known she would come. A slow warmth spread through her chest, unfamiliar and unsettling in the best way. She swallowed hard. "You should have told me sooner." Gabriel smirked, tilting his head. "Would you have believed me?" Rilke huffed, looking away. "No." He chuckled, the sound deep and knowing. "That's what I thought." For a while, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, casting flickering light over the stone walls, over the home they had built together. Then, slowly, Rilke leaned toward him, just enough that her shoulder brushed his. Gabriel didn't move away. She wasn't sure how long they sat there like that, breathing in the silence, the warmth of the fire, the weight of something neither of them had to say aloud anymore. But when Gabriel finally reached out, threading his fingers through hers, she didn't pull away. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't lost. She was home. The days stretched into something different. Their wounds healed, their bodies grew stronger, and the constant urgency of survival eased into something quieter. The storms had passed, leaving the air warm, the sun golden against the jagged cliffs. For the first time since being thrown onto this planet, Rilke felt like she was living, not just enduring. She had spent so much of her life in control of her emotions, her body, her purpose. But now, sitting by the fire, watching Gabriel work under the fading light, she felt something else entirely. A slow, burning awareness. Gabriel moved with an easy kind of strength, his bare back glistening with sweat as he lifted another stone, placing it carefully into the wall he was reinforcing. She had seen him fight, had seen the sheer force he could unleash, but here, now, there was patience in his movements. A quiet determination that fascinated her. "You always work this hard?" she asked, her voice carrying through the stillness. Gabriel chuckled without looking back. "You always watch this much?" Rilke smirked, leaning back on her elbows. "Only when there's something worth watching." That made him pause. He turned, resting an arm on the stone, eyes locking onto hers. There was a heat in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Or maybe she had just been too stubborn to acknowledge it. "You keep looking at me like that, Rilke," he said, voice lower now, "and I'm going to start thinking you like what you see." She didn't look away. "I do," she admitted. Gabriel's expression flickered. Something darker, more intense taking hold. The teasing edge was still there, but underneath, something had shifted. The fire crackled between them, but neither moved. And then, as if some unseen tether finally snapped, Rilke crossed the space between them. She didn't hesitate. She stepped into his space, into his warmth, pressing her hands against his chest. His skin was hot beneath her palms, his breath hitching as she dragged her fingertips over the ridges of muscle. Gabriel didn't stop her. He let her touch him, let her explore, his body tensing beneath her hands but never pulling away. "Rilke," he murmured, almost like a warning. She tilted her head. "Do you want me to stop?" His fingers twitched at his sides. His jaw clenched. Then finally he moved. His hands settled on her hips, strong and grounding, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. Their breaths mingled, the heat between them thick, slow burning. "I don't want you to stop," he admitted, voice rough. She smiled. "Good." And then she pushed him back against the stone, pressing her body flush against his. Gabriel let out a sharp breath, eyes dark with something unreadable, something wanting. He wasn't used to being the one overpowered. Neither was she, but it thrilled her. She dragged her lips along his jaw, her hands running down his sides, feeling the tension in him, the barely restrained control, the way he was letting her take whatever she wanted. And she wanted all of him. His breath stuttered when she rolled her hips against his, testing, teasing. His grip on her tightened, fingers digging into her skin. "Rilke!" His voice broke slightly, and the sound sent a shiver down her spine. She loved it. She loved how he reacted to her. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her lips ghosting over his, her voice barely a whisper. "You always let a woman take control like this, human?" Gabriel let out a low, strained chuckle. "No." His hand slid lower, gripping her firmly. "But I think I might like it." Rilke smirked, then stopped thinking. She kissed him then, slow but hungry, savoring the way he responded instantly. No hesitation, no uncertainty. His lips moved against hers like he had been waiting for this, like he had needed this just as much as she did. When he finally flipped their positions, pinning her back against the stone instead, she gasped, but not from surprise. From sheer, breathless anticipation. The firelight flickered, casting golden shadows over their bodies, over the home they had built together. And as the night stretched on, they forgot about the stars above them. Because right now, the only thing that mattered was each other.